I have the benefit of covering the Pentagon for 20 years now, so I know a lot of people. Have been overseas with them in the muck and in the dust of Afghanistan or Iraq. So you have a certain street cred when you're with soldiers or Marines over in Afghanistan, and they respect you for coming over. And a lot of times what I do is I'll bring cigars over, Cohiba cigars that I'll buy in Dubai, and dip. I give the dip to the soldiers and the cigars to the officers. And it's a good icebreaker, because if you're at a combat outpost, there's nothing going on. You're sitting around at night and around a fire, and you hand out cigars and some dip, and you're relaxing, and they kind of let their hair down, and they just they relax and talk about their lives, and then you can get a sense then of what's going on in Afghanistan. You know, what's your perspective? Because there's no recorder out, there's no notebook, we're just having a conversation, but it really helps tell the story. So cigars help, dip helps. Also, you can name drop. That's what I do a lot, because again, I've been covering the military so long that I can go out to some area. Let's say I'm talking to a colonel and say, oh, I was out here last year with this other colonel. Oh yeah, I know that guy. So this colonel would think, well, if Tom knows this other colonel, who's a good friend of mine, he can't be all that bad. So you name drop, you develop sources, you cold call people sometimes. A lot of people on Capitol Hill I talk with, and that's really important, because if you're covering the military, obviously Congress oversees the military, so you have to get into that area as well. Who does the oversight of the Pentagon? Who are the aides? Who are the congressmen? Who should I get in contact with besides just folks at the Pentagon? And also at the White House, how do I reach out to them? And a lot of times it's you go through the public affairs people, you get to know people, but again, you have to develop that sort of trust quickly, or at least sort of a familiarity with what they do. And you do that by just talking to them like a human being. You know, where are you from originally? Well, I'm from, Rhode Island. Really, I grew up in Boston, just up the highway. And I think when you meet almost anybody, 3 or 4 questions, you can connect with that person somehow. And I think that's very, very important. Connecting with that person, having a cup of coffee with them, or go out for a beer. My sense is, if you have a coffee or a beer with almost anyone, and you're connecting with them as a human, you have that person. You can go back to that person. A friend of mine who works at the Wall Street Journal said, I'm in sales. I sell myself every day to these people I'm trying to talk with. I think that's a good way to look at it. Going overseas is much more difficult. You're in a different culture, especially Afghanistan. For example, I couldn't go up and interview a woman. It would be considered, bad form. So I might bring a female producer with me who can interview the woman. And also, I think you really need a good fixer, a translator when you go to some of these places, who can open doors for you that I could never open. I don't look like an Afghan guy, so as soon as I show up someplace, clearly this guy's not from the neighborhood. So how do I talk to these people? How do I reach out to them? And you have to have a really good fixer or translator to open those doors for you. I was over in Afghanistan about a year ago trying to talk to this warlord. His name is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and his nickname is the Butcher of Kabul. And he's a pretty tough guy. So I tried to reach out to him and went through his aides. And they call him His Excellency in reference. So I would use that term when talking about, rather than say the Butcher of Kabul, it's like, well, I'd like to reach out to His Excellency and talk with him. So you're respectful, and little techniques you can do. In Afghanistan, it's considered bad form to give someone a firm handshake. It's considered rude. So there are little cultural tips you learn. So you give a very light handshake, and then you go like, you hold your hand to your heart like that. That's the Afghan way. So a couple of respectful things like that, a good fixer translator, and explain why you're there, what you hope to do. And it is more of a challenge, but I think, again, if you have the right people in your corner helping out, open doors, that's very, very important. Well, interesting you mentioned that. It's like a sprint every single day, because of course the president likes to tweet. And I remember this is about summer 2017, I was coming into the house, just got back from the gym, sweaty, and the phone rings. And it's morning edition. on NPR. It's like, can you go on the air in 20 minutes? And I have an ISDN line at my home, so I can turn it on, and it sounds like I'm sitting right in the studio. And I said, well, what's going on? They said, well, didn't you see Trump's tweet? I'm like, no, I don't read this guy's tweets every day. He said, well, he's going to throw all the transgender folks out of the military. I'm like, oh my God. And my heart's racing, and I try to remember what stories I've done on transgender, what's the policy, how many are there, what's then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis going to do about it, what has he said about it. So I spent frantic 10 minutes trying to find my old stories, how many transgender folks are there in the military. And then I go on the air and they say, well, Tom, what does this all mean? I said, I really don't know, because he just tweets. And a tweet is not a policy, so we're going to have to make calls to the Pentagon and see what they say. And you call the Pentagon, and they say the same thing. It's like, we don't know what it means. We just saw the president's tweet just like you did. So what's unusual about being a reporter now in Washington is this president will have just a knee-jerk reaction to something. Oh, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to throw all the troops out of Syria, all 2,000 troops. That's another interesting story, because I was in Syria last year around this time, and these US military guys working with these Kurdish fighters said, Tom, it's going to be at least another 2 years to defeat ISIS and stabilize this area. We have to bring back water and sewer and electricity. We have to train a local force so they can stabilize this area. Just because we defeat ISIS doesn't mean it's over. We have to stay for quite some time. And I say, okay, got it. And I get home, and the president says, we'll be leaving Syria very shortly. So I said, well, wait a minute, 2 years, leaving shortly. So I go to the Pentagon, to the senior guy, and I said, hey, I'm kind of confused, because I was just over in Syria with your guys, and they said about 2 years. The president said, we'll be leaving shortly. Do you guys kind of have to go to the White House and explain what you're doing? He looks at me and says, every freaking day. He did not say freaking. So I think they're trying to figure out how to work with this White House. And it's very difficult on them. It's annoying. They don't know what the policy is, because this policy shifts all the time. Afghanistan, the president says we're going to take 7,000 troops out of Afghanistan, half the troops there. He said it once. They went to talk to him, say it's probably not a good idea to do it. And he says, okay, forget it, I'll move on to something else. So there's this real sort of dynamic at the Pentagon about, we don't know what's going on. We don't know what the policy is. We're waiting to see what the White House says. But we have to go back and explain to the president all the time about what we do and how we do it. Now remember, the president has no experience in foreign policy, military policy, or even domestic policy. He is a real estate guy. He's a marketing guy. So a lot of this is new to him. And what the Pentagon will say is, the president will, he canceled military exercises with the South Koreans. Those are really important exercises, because you train as you fight. You have to be ready for any contingency in case North Korea invades. That's why you have to do it. And I was talking to one general who said, we never thought we'd have to explain why we train, the importance of training. And he wasn't really criticizing the president. He just said, we just never anticipated we would have to explain something so obvious to the White House, but they have to. So it's a fascinating time to be a reporter in Washington. I'm a little immune to the sort of the difficulties of the White House, that press corps, screaming at them fake news and so forth, because the Pentagon, interestingly, is kind of an oasis away from that. But they do have a hard time, officials at the Pentagon, trying to figure out and try to navigate what the president wants. And then at times, explaining to him why this probably is not a good idea. And you just saw that today, because the president wanted all the troops taken out of Syria. They're ending up keeping about 200 troops there. So it looks like the Pentagon won out. Well, back when I first started covering the Pentagon, I really didn't travel that much. I did most of my reporting in the Pentagon. So you go to the briefings, you have background briefings with some officials, you go to hearings on Capitol Hill. The important thing about going someplace is you get a better understanding of what's going on. And I tell fellow reporters at the Pentagon that you'll never understand Afghanistan unless you have to go there. So you have to talk to Afghans, you have to talk to US soldiers and Marines in Afghanistan. You'll get a much different perspective about what's really going on. And these guys on the ground, fighting the Taliban, training the Afghan soldiers, they have a better sense of the way ahead and what's going on than their bosses do back at the Pentagon. And the other benefit of that is nobody's going to snow me at the Pentagon. They're going to say, oh, and oftentimes they do, they say, well, Tom, these Afghan troops are in the lead now. The Americans are kind of taking the back seat. They are doing all the patrols, they're leading the patrols. And I can say, hang on a second. I just got back from Afghanistan. They are not leading the patrols. It's still the Americans doing it. So don't tell me that, because that's just not true, General. And that's the benefit of going to a place like that. Nobody can, can snow you. Nobody can give you false information, because you were there and you saw it with your own eyes. That's the benefit of going to these places, because you'll never understand it unless you go there. Well, it's interesting. There was a reporter named Richard Ben Kramer, and he was a political reporter. And I went to see him speak once at a conference. And his manner was not, an interrogator kind of questioner. His method was more, I'm kind of having a hard time. Explain to me how this happened. They say you stole $500,000 from the state fund, and you say you're innocent. So walk me through, because I'm kind of confused how that happened. Now, another method would be, listen, we know you stole that $500,000. That's what prosecutors say. What do you have to say about it? So there's a different manner in how you can do it, right? You're trying to get information. You don't necessarily have to stick it to someone and be so aggressive. You're trying to get information. So in some cases, asking the question, being persistent, but do it in a way that sometimes puts the person at ease. Now, sometimes you have to be more aggressive, depending on who you're talking with, but oftentimes it's just walk me through how this happens and putting the person at ease. A good example of that is I interviewed the police chief of Kandahar, Afghanistan, Lieutenant General Abdul Razik, and he frankly was a war criminal. There were UN reports, human rights reports about summary executions, torturing people with drills, hanging people up by their hands, people disappearing, and all sorts of misbehavior. And I went to interview him. And he was a pretty tough guy, and his guards were all around holding AK-47s while we're doing the interview. And I had all the UN reports, I had the human rights reports in front of me, and I marked off certain areas about what they said he did. And I just said to him, well, we started out by talking about how safe Kandahar is. He said, yes, because I'm police chief, there's no Taliban here, you can walk around, everything's safe. And I said, well, here's the problem, because the UN says you lined 20 people up at a trench and killed them, pushed them into the trench, that you kidnap people, that you torture them with drills. And he's just kind of staring at me the whole time. And I said, no, I'm not saying this about you. The UN is. So there, again, you don't have to be really aggressive. You want to be persistent and say, this is what they're saying. How do you explain it? You see? I guess, what's it like to be in a war zone? People ask, what do you wear? Do you have your own body armor? I do. How do you get around? Sometimes we go with the U.S. military. Sometimes we drive around Kabul with our friends just in a Toyota. What do you eat? Where do you go? When you're out with Marines, what do you eat? I say, well, sometimes it's like MREs, meals ready to eat, which are awful. Sometimes we'll go off with Afghan soldiers and eat with them. So you're eating this huge spread of goat and rice and fruit. So those are the kind of common questions. It's like, what's it like to live in a war zone? What do you do? My worst experience, I think, in a war zone was we were out with Marines in this area called Helmand Province in Afghanistan. And it was 120 degrees. And we went out with the Marines into this sort of remote area, remote village. And they took over this, what looked like a cow pasture almost. It was a wall around this area. And they moved their vehicle in there to have a little protection. And there were all these weeds inside there. And so they were hacking up the weeds, and then they actually were digging foxholes. And it was 2013, and I said, 2013, you're still in foxholes. It was miserable. It was 120. It was just, we were drinking warm water because that's all we had in MREs. I got to tell you, if the Taliban showed up in a truck, I probably would have hopped in and just left with them. It was awful.